Welcome to WBC Faster Together, the LinkedIn Live series of Women Business Collaborative. I'm Gwen Young, Chief Operating Officer of the WBC. And today we are joined by Esther Aguilera, CEO of Latino Corporate Directors Association, and Jessica Grounds, co-founder of Mind the Gap. WBC is an unprecedented alliance of over 70 women business organizations and hundreds of business leaders building a movement to achieve equal position, pay, and power for all women in business. Through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability, we are mobilizing thousands to create momentum and accelerate the pace of change. We live our commitment to DEI, and members of our leadership, a diverse board of directors, and advisory and leaders councils include more than 34% people of color. Please check the chat for our 9 action initiatives through which we aim to accelerate change and join our movement at wbcollaborative.org. Each week in this series, we offer different ways to advocate change and accelerate impact by presenting data, research, and best practices, by lifting up the power of women's voices for change, and by showcasing the importance of cross-generational collaboration and the allyship of men in the movement. Today, we want to talk about the WBC Women Leading Boards Report and the state of women on boards, including diversity in ethnicity and skill sets, cyber governance to audit, and how women on boards lead business purpose, impact, and gender equity in the workplace. This is a topic we monitor monthly through our Women Joining Public Board reports, annually through our collaborative publication with 50/50 women on boards in all of our board groups called Women Leading Boards, and that we're going to talk about September 22nd at our WBC Action for Impact Annual Summit. So let's get started. We're joined today by Esther Aguilera, CEO of Latino Corporate Directors Association, and Jessica Grounds, co-founder of Mind the Gap. Welcome, Esther. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Gwen. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen.
Always a pleasure to talk to you all. So I want to sort of continue from our conversation of 10 minutes ago and today, but let's start with our report that we released in April, where it shows women comprise about 27 of board seats on the Russell 3000, and women of color are lagging, with Latinas only 1% of board seats. What's the state of play for women in color, and how can we work to sort of increase women in diversity on boards? Esther, let's start with you at Latino Corporate Directors.
Thank you. Well, look, there is much to celebrate that we've made gains for women overall. But as you mentioned, Gwen, there is, I think, in terms of our sisterhood and all of our women's organizations, if any one of our groups lags as badly as Latinas, we all need to kind of rally behind Latinas. As you mentioned, it's only 1% of corporate boards. And by the way, USA Today did a new report on and have been tracking the numbers in the executive suite, and so has McKinsey. Latinas are only 1.6% in senior roles in corporate America. In 21st century America, this is unacceptable because Latinos are 2 in 10 women in the country. And there's so much talent. The talent pool is strong. We can go into that a little bit more, but I think there's a lot that we can do together.
Yeah, and thank you. I just want to say first to Gwen and Women's Business Collaborative, thanks for bringing us all together, because we're stronger together in sharing ideas and sharing resources. I am very grateful to work with Esther and Latino Corporate Directors Association with my work in California Partners Project. And we have been tracking here, and I'm in California. Many of you know the first laws to require women on corporate boards, along with people of color and LGBT directors. Those confluence of laws have been very powerful here. But in terms of the women of color in particular, we have looked at those percentages. So for example, as of last year, of all the corporate board directors in California, only 6.6% were women of color. Fast forward spring of this year, we're about 9.4%. But as Esther shared, this, particularly for Latinas, only 1.5% of corporate board seats here in California are held by Latinas, even though Latinos are the plurality of the state. And women of color in particular are 30% of the state, but are highly underrepresented on boards. So we've seen progress here, and I'm happy to share those numbers in a little bit around California overall. We have seen a massive increase in terms of women on boards, but we need to be very clear about women of color. There has been an increase. AAPI women are now 5% of corporate board directors here in California. White women are 22%, and Black women are almost 4%, almost 3%. So again, we're growing, but we have a lot of work to do, and it's such a key importance. And I just want to say one more thing, which is when we talk about the impact, and I think that's what we all talk about a lot, Esther and I, we think about what changes for a board when women, especially women of color, are there. And I'm reminded of a story from Stacey Brown Philpott, who's on Nordstrom board. I interviewed her for one of my reports, and she shared this amazing story about post George Floyd, and Nordstrom was grappling with challenges of looting of their stores, but also how to respond to this horrible situation with George Floyd. And she said, Jessica, we had 3 Black directors on that board, and our ability to respond to that incident was so much more effective because we were part of the conversation. So I think we have to tell, tell those stories.
And just before we get off the California side, thank you, Jessica. You know, to put it in context, and Jessica mentioned this, Latinos are 40% of the state, and 40% of the women are Latinas. And the numbers are, again, just to emphasize that, you know, we're going to get into the conversation some more, but there's just, we cannot find this acceptable.
Sorry, I want to stay on the California law firm, and because we talked a little bit about what the numbers look like, right? And the fact, to Jessica and both of your points, both, you know, representation matters, you know, and decision making and inclusion matters. But, you know, with these 2 California laws, because we've heard a lot about them this year with the challenges, right? And we've heard about the NASDAQ tax and so forth. You know, how important are these kinds of laws or these kinds of mechanisms, both in terms of progress and kind of what has the impact been as we talk about these?
Well, I'm happy to share, just for those of you who aren't familiar, the gender law passed in 2018, and it required 1 woman on a board as of 2019, and then 2 or 3 as of 2021, depending on the size of the board. And then the race and ethnicity law was similar, and it was a staggered increase where most boards, because of their size, need to have at least 3 diverse directors, which are outlined in AB 979 as most people of color, African-American, Black, Latino, Native American, Asian Pacific Islander, and LGBT. So there's these confluence of laws have been really meaningful in having boards pivot towards saying, do we have diverse representation? And let's look at these numbers. In 2018, before the law passed in California, women represented 15.5% of corporate board seats. 29% of companies here in California had 0 women on their boards of any color. And 53% of microcaps, which are still big, right? 300 million or less in market valuation, had 0 women on their boards. Today, almost 32% as of March of this year, we know are women on board. So we have doubled the percentage of women on boards. And I would agree. I mean, I don't know if Esther agrees. That means the law works, right? We're focused on increasing those numbers. So we've literally almost tripled the raw numbers of corporate board directors that identify as women.
Yes, and you know what, that is a success story. I would add the fact that the 2 laws are challenged should be a call to action or a rallying cry for all of us, that our job in this work today is more important than ever, because even with gains, we can't let our guard down. You know, there's also a NASDAQ rule. NASDAQ adopted a diversity rule as well. And by the way, it's being challenged. So I think that the more that we raise awareness about this, and the fact that, hey, there were some gains made, we need to celebrate them, but we need to, in the work of WBC, getting everybody together to ensure that we continue in a strategic way to build even more momentum is so important. And I mention it also because, one, you know, boards today are facing a lot of different you know, challenges and topics to be on top of. And there is stakeholder activism in terms of, or stakeholder capitalism to bring into account stakeholders that make companies better. And that is coupled with shareholder activism. So if you're on a board, what I have seen is the best boards combine and make the most of both engaging both obviously with their shareholder and shareholder activism, as well as stakeholders, and staying on top of those key topics. And that relates to what we're talking about today with women being one of the most important stakeholders here that we're talking about.
Part of that commitment from that kind of companies of purpose movement, as you said, Esther, you sort of shift from shareholder only to shareholder and stakeholder, and that commitment. I want to shift the conversation to slightly to kind of more tactical, right? So you have the commitment, we have a rallying cry, we've got these kind of laws, these taxes, if you will. What are some of the other things we can do in kind of building up that both that pipeline, that promotion on women on boards? You know, with the WBC, we're talking a lot about allyship. We love to talk about what best practices that companies or organizations are doing. And for example, we have a program now where we're training women board members in cybersecurity governance so that we can help them, you know, kind of hone their expertise and raise their power on the boards. But I'd love to talk to you both about what are some of the things we can do to continue to increase the diversity as outside of these laws and so forth that we've been talking about, and the commitment?
You know, one important thing is that there, especially for women of color and Latinas, there is a misinformation that there isn't enough talent. In fact, the California law and NASDAQ were challenged, and one of the main arguments, well, you know, there isn't enough supply on this diversity side to meet and effectively lead these boards, and we need to counter that in very powerful ways. I'll tell you, our work, we are tracking Latinas and Latinos. There is such an ample pool of very qualified individuals, regardless of, you know, industry and functional expertise. And this has been, you know, in fact, directors, 30% of directors surveyed by KPMG found that, you know, they believe that the barrier to getting more diversity is lack of talent. Today, there is more resources for non-gov chairs, non-gov committees and boards to tap fabulous talent that would immediately bring insight and business acumen, what is needed to help, you know, guide the companies. And so we need to really dispel that myth. Gwen, there's a lot more to talk about in terms of, you know, what barriers Latinos are facing, but in terms of what we all could be doing together is, you know, send them to us, send them to other folks. There is ample talent, and we're here to be a resource.
Yeah, and I would say there's two primary focus areas. One is the board itself, recognizing their own gaps in understanding what diversity looks like, not only the talent piece where Esther's speaking to so well, which is this misguided thinking that there isn't talent that's rich and diverse, which there is, and that needing to be demystified, but also the processes that boards take are problematic. They look within their own network. Most of the network of board directors are white men. So who do they know? They're white men. They're not thinking outside of that diversity. Also, what we spoke to is the competencies of what board directors need. Post-COVID, it has blown up. It has changed. If you look at what the proxy advisors and the institutional investors are pushing for, it's a diversity of background. We need HR experts. We need people who've done diversity work on the board level. This is a strategic imperative for a board to think about not only the diversity, but all the challenges they have to mitigate against. So the board itself, and then I love that we're talking about the pipeline in terms of the C-suite, because my world is women's leadership and how do we move up? And the C-suite is getting more diverse, but it is, we do need to work on putting and encouraging and supporting, particularly women of color. I find they tend to be sometimes the only ones in those roles, and they aren't supported to thrive. And we have to be thoughtful and intentional and recognize those things. It's not because of their lack of ability, it's the structure behind them that don't support them to thrive in the way they can. And so those two forces need to happen between the executive C-suite of a company and the board to really think thoughtfully, because if we don't have diversity at the top, people who are diverse and people who are the underrepresented groups we're speaking of are going to feel like they can thrive in that company. They're going to self-select out also. That's another dynamic.
Yeah.
So these are all forces that happen together.
Yeah, and I would just chime in on the C-suite as well. By the way, I put in the chat, USA Today did a phenomenal research on, we've done it for every demographic, but the numbers on Latinas in senior roles is only 1.6%. And yet, what's great about the report is it interviewed a lot of C-suite level Latinas who talked about the types of barriers. I mean, you had one, she was C-suite at Boeing and Westinghouse. And when she was, going up the ranks, she talked about her background. She said, yes, I'm Mexican American. And her supervisor told her, well, it's a good thing you don't look it because otherwise you wouldn't get ahead. I mean, this is documented in these interviews. Another, she's CFO. She goes with her colleague to meet the client and they're talking to the guy instead of her. And she has to remind him, I'm the CFO. And there's a lot of microaggressions as well as, look, a slight accent. An accent does not dictate sort of your intelligence and what you bring to the table. There's just way too many barriers still today that are really leaving amazing talent off the table. We need to put them on the table. So we all need to make sure that we're continuing to be their voices and be voices for each other. I will say one thing, McKinsey also, and in their annual report, this is a challenge because McKinsey's report of women in the workplace found that women of color are stepping up to mentor and especially at the critical times when you want to hear about when there's an opportunity available. White women and white men are not trending and not supporting people of color and Latinas and women of color like they should be. I think we need to talk about this. I'm raising it now as probably a topic for a larger conversation, but take a look at the McKinsey report. I'll put it in the chat. We think that we're doing great in this space, but I think that the allyship question that you brought up, Gwen, is so important here. There is more that we need to do on the allyship front. Latinas and women of color need the white women and the white men there for them, and it's not in the numbers it should be.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, I can't agree more with Esther, especially for white women. White women carry two pieces. They carry a privilege of being white, and they carry the challenge of recognizing as women some of the challenges we have in the workplace. So we often are those critical, and we're 22% of corporate boards, for example, in California, we're the largest sort of underrepresented group, if you will. So how do we then be the conduit to change for people of color broadly, for LGBT, for people who are different? We have that ability to speak to it. And actually the research on boards suggests that women of all backgrounds are really they're the key to talking about that diversity. They're bringing it up. They see it as a strategic imperative. And so we need to lean into that. And as Esther said, talk about the research and talk about what's not working, because that's a problem that we're not mentoring and bringing and sponsoring the next generation of talent that's coming up.
Absolutely. And you both brought up that too, and even sort of the broader allyship, as you said, but also that kind of link. I think it's always interesting with boards too, that link between the C-suite or the CEO. What's that magic link? If you've got a female CEO and a female board chair, right? Or a male board chair and a female CEO, what's that link about being able to make that bridge so that you can bring in not just the women, but everybody, diversity of skill set, diversity of ethnicity and background. So we're running up against time. So we always end these with kind of, what's the one piece of advice, right? What can and we'll start with you, Jessica, because I know this is what you and I, do every day, but what is something that corporations and organizations do to ensure that they're advancing true diverse leadership up to the most senior levels, whether that's the C-suite or whether that's the board?
The number one thing is, if you're in a position of leadership, you have to visibly and verbally talk about how diversity will connect and provide for the outcomes of your organization. What I mean by that is, and that it matters. It is a key imperative. They have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to say, this is a priority. So in all of the ways we're practicing life, bringing in new talent, we have to think about the unconscious bias that Esther spoke to. Where are our own biases and barriers impacting the talent we're bringing in? For example, we have to look maybe to new and different HBCUs, other organizations, other historically Latino colleges and universities where talent is there that we aren't paying attention to because of our own biases. So I think it really has to come. That's my number one thing, is the top has to talk about it, because it'll permeate down to the people they oversee. And then it becomes critical to changing all of the processes where there could be real key barriers.
Yes. Well, and I would add that, look, at the end of the day, the business case is what is our strongest case. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, we have a diverse and growing marketplace that companies need to pay attention to. And if you don't have your full team on the board representing and making sure that you've got the blind spots covered, you're working with, less than 50% of the team. So, I love this analogy that if the board doesn't have, women adequately represented, again, you're working with 50% of your team in a field where the other side is in better shape. For Latino and Latinas, if you don't have Latino and Latinas on your board, you're working with only 70% of your team. You're leaving out a huge, important growth. The growth in consumers and employees are Latino. So it's not just about the right thing to do. This is a smart business thing to do.
That's great.
That's the perfect way. Well, thank you, Esther. Thank you, Esther and Jessica.
We've got a new title for ourselves. Jessica.
I like the combination, and it suggests energy and impact, which I love. But thank you both. And unfortunately, this is all we have time for. We invite you, the audience, to wbcollaborative.org to learn more about WBC's initiatives to increase women in the C-suite and boardroom, to address the underrepresentation of women in areas like access to capital and industry, and advance a pipeline of women leaders that will bring gender and pay parity, diversity, equity, and inclusion to the business landscape. So join us next Thursday, where we'll talk with Tacey Byam of DDI and Rosina Reciopi of Women Unlimited to talk about our soon-to-be-released paper on non-traditional pathways to the C-suite and what the C-suite of today looks like, to Jessica's point earlier. And join us weekly to keep up to date on our next guest, on our progress and the movement for gender parity in business by following us on social media at WB Collaborative on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and have a great September 1st.
Thanks,
Happy
everybody.
September.
Happy September 1st.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
It's great to start the month